No lizards. No aliens. No nonsense. This is Reality Bytes in association with Sovereign Independent UK and One World Chronicle.
Welcome to Reality Bytes on the 18th of November 2014. This is not Paul Alive, as you can have guessed. It's Neil, and I'm covering for Paula tonight I'm covering for Paula tonight, that's it. We have a guest tonight, Brandon Turbeville. Have I pronounced that right, Brandon?
Hey Neil, thanks for having me on.
Yep. You write many articles for a number of sites, including Activist Post amongst others, and you have your own site, brandonturbeville.com. Do you want to give us a little bit of your background and explain how you got into all this?
Sure. As you mentioned, I'm a writer for activistpost.com as well as a couple of other sites like the antimedia.org and Irrelevant Paradigm. And I'm also, I've got my own website, which is kind of the hub of all my work, brandonturbeville.com. Got my own radio show as well. I do once a week for about an hour called Truth on the Tracks over at ucy.tv. And I write on a number of different subjects. I've focused more on geopolitics as of late, but over time I've written about 450 or so odd articles, so it's covered many more things than just geopolitics. And I've got 6 books out. The latest is The Road to Damascus, the Anglo-American Assault on Syria, which covers the situation in Syria. It's a couple years old now, but it follows the situation from the beginning up to, well, where we were a couple of years ago, but it gives you a good background on what actually was transpiring and who was behind it and who were the players in the Syrian crisis. And as for how I got into all of this this information, I guess I should say that I've always kind of felt that there was something about the world that wasn't quite what I was being told through media, through religion or schooling, and it turns out that I was right after I found several sources of information. Kind of went down a long rabbit hole and started doing research that was a little deeper than just watching a documentary or two, but actually going into the actual documents and looking at some historical books and even watching things as they unfold live. I think one of the biggest things for me was 9/11 personally, and that to me was when I really started to question the nature of events as they unfold and across the world and here at home. So, it's been a long road, but at this point, when you figure out that this type of system and this overarching agenda really does exist, you have to do what you can to expose it and to stop it and replace it with something else.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you. Again, like yourself, I kind of always had this opinion that there was something wrong with the world, but couldn't quite put my finger on what it was, and I was always a bit of a rebel at school and never really paid much attention to what the teachers had to say, but always kind of got by. And on the day of 9/11, I mean, it's one of those things everybody remembers when Elvis died or whatever, John Lennon was shot. But 9/11, I used to have a cafe in Ireland, and I'd driven off to the cash and carry, and they had the TV in the cash and carry, and I saw the first tower being hit, and I thought, oh, this is quite bizarre, And at that time, I didn't know they were talking about terrorism because there was no sound on the TV. They were just showing this footage over and over again. And I drove back home instead of going back to the cafe. And then I saw the second one being hit. And at that point, I just thought, this just isn't right. There's something just not right about this. These things just don't happen. These things just don't fall down like this. And I didn't know anything technical about the structure of buildings or anything like that, but it just didn't sit right. And like yourself, I started looking at all sorts of things, and there's some rabbit holes you go down and you think, well, that's not right either, and you crawl back up those ones and go down other ones. But
yeah, Neil, for me, it wasn't actually the building collapse that made me start to question the official story of 9/11. It was actually the response of the government. It was the Patriot Act that just happened to be set up waiting for 9/11 to happen. In fact, just as a quick aside, since we have some time here, I'll mention that years before 9/11, I was driving down the road, and of all people, I had Howard Stern's radio show on, and so don't judge me, but I was listening to it, and they were discussing a law that was being considered, which would have given the FBI and intelligence agencies the right to read emails or maybe not so much emails, but telephone calls and mail and so forth of American citizens. And he told the person who reported that to him that he thought they were crazy. There was a conspiracy theory and all that. And then they actually called the FBI office, and the gentleman who answered their call flatly told them that, yeah, you could expect in the next few years that the FBI would have this power, and that it was going to happen. The question was just when, not if. And I listened to that, and I thought, that's scary. I don't want the government to have that power. And then years later, we have 9/11 occurring, and the Patriot Act is just sitting there waiting. And that was one of the things that stuck in the back of my mind was, wait a minute, I remember years ago hearing about this law that was being crafted, and this policy that the intelligence agency wanted. And then I saw as it unfolded the rhetoric that was being used. I remember Bush saying, let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories. And at the time I heard that, I thought, well, what are the conspiracy theories? Because I didn't know there were any. And I ended up, at the time I was reading George Orwell's 1984 for the first time. And what I was reading in the book, I was watching in real time right here in the United States, right here on the television. And then it started to click to me, maybe the official story of these events is not entirely true. And then you start to think, well, maybe they actually knew it was going to happen and let it happen in order to get certain things passed or to get certain agendas pushed through. And then you start looking at the information and realize, no, it actually goes much deeper than that they didn't just let it happen, that it was orchestrated and controlled from the very, very beginning to the very end.
Yeah, I mean, the building collapse was my initial response, and then, like yourself, you start looking at things, and in the UK, all of a sudden we had armed policemen, we had soldiers at the airports, and with machine guns, and like you say, there were all these laws were ready to come in, and suddenly we're all taking our shoes off at airports and belts, and all sorts of ridiculous stuff. I mean, we come to the stage where a plastic bag is supposed to stop a tube of toothpaste blowing up. And ridiculous things. I've even gone to, I mean, every time I travel from the UK on my own, I'm stopped and searched. And I keep saying to them, I say, I think it's 9 times out of 10 now where I've travelled myself and I've been stopped. And every time I travel with somebody else, they're stopped. And I just say to them, how come this is random when I'm getting stopped every time I do it? I said, you're just unlucky. I said, well, really? I said, well, I'd love to go to a bookies and get some odds on this, because it must be like astonishing. I'd like to put some money on it that I'm going to get stopped every time I come through the airport. They, oh no, it's just random. It's just random. And then one of them actually told me that the so-called metal detectors don't actually work. They're just set to go off randomly. And I've said this to other people in the airports and said, look, I've been told by one of the staff at another airport that these things just go off randomly. And you're telling me I'm getting picked out randomly every time I come through. So where's the randomness of that? What are the odds of that? And I don't know what it is about these people, but I did hear they were employing them on the back of pizza boxes at one time in the United States, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was the same in the UK. But I don't know. But anyway, moving on. So your interest in the Middle East, where did that stem from?
Well, I just when this began, this was sort of the tail end of the Arab Spring. I was watching the situation in Libya, and this was the overthrow of Gaddafi and the brutal murder of Gaddafi that was broadcast all over television. And then in an effort, while I was reporting on that situation, we saw the beginning of the Syrian situation, and just researching that as it began, it's actually so clear that what this was a color revolution, destabilization effort by the U.S. government, the British government, NATO in general, that I just continued following the situation and reporting on it. So it started pretty early on. I mean, this situation began at around 2010 in earnest, when the death squads and the snipers started firing, sniping at children and men and women, and on the way to the market and on the way to school and so forth. And I just followed it ever since.
So I guess that brings us to where we are now in this debacle, if you want to call it that, this organised debacle and chaos which has been created in the Middle East over 2 decades now or longer. The whole ISIS thing. Yeah, I mean, you've got a little piece in your article. ISIS agrees to work with itself. You've got a little. It's almost like an algebraic equation. I'll just scroll down to find it. Where you've got. I can't find it now.
Well, I guess I could kind of recite it to you, because it's actually more simple than it sounds than it looks. Because if you just remember that, whether you're talking about ISIS or Al Qaeda or Al Nusra, it's all the same thing. People would do well to research where all this stuff came from. For instance, just to look at the history of ISIS. I mean, we're given the story that ISIS just popped up out in the desert of Iraq and Syria, and it just it took large swaths of territory, of Iraqi territory, defeating the military, consolidating power, gathering territory in Syria, and the United States just didn't know. We had no idea that it was happening until it had already happened. And perhaps they were just too busy reading all of our emails. Perhaps they got backlogged with our chat data or metadata, that they couldn't see that the ISIS forces were marching across Iraq and Syria. This is beyond belief. Of course, all they had to do was look at the internet and look at Iraqi media reports to see what was happening. Of course, they knew what was happening because they were directing it. But the history of ISIS itself, if you look at the leader of ISIS, which is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, right? We've heard a lot about him in recent months. This guy, he was at one time the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and he was actually a fighter who fought against Saddam Hussein, not necessarily the Americans at the time, or anyone else, but Saddam Hussein, and he eventually became designated as the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which itself morphed into the Islamic Emirate of Iraq, right? And the IEI actually had sort of a tentacle in Syria. The sister organization to the Islamic Emirate of Iraq was called Al-Nusra Front. So it's the same organization, just slightly different name change for crossing a line in the sand. Then from that, the name change was changed to the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and the Levant, which then became the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, which then became Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or Sham. Same thing, same organization, and now it's of course called the Islamic State. So it's all the same organization. You can call it Al-Qaeda, you can call it Al-Nusra, you can call it ISIS, you can call it ISIL, IEI, doesn't matter. It's the same organization. And this farce that we're being told that Al-Nusra is fighting Al-Qaeda and they're fighting ISIS. I mean, you can look at the reports, you can look at the quotes from people like Basil Idris, who have stated that the Free Syrian Army, for instance, works with ISIS. I should step back a minute and mention that the Free Syrian Army itself, it's painted as the moderate rebels, but there are no moderate rebels in Syria. So again, whether you hear those names of terrorist organizations that I've just mentioned, or whether you hear the name moderate rebels, quote-unquote opposition fighters, or the Free Syrian Army, you can just assume that they're the same organizations. The Free Syrian Army is well known for atrocities. When the Free Syrian Army would take over territory in Syria, they would engage in imposing Sharia law on the citizens. They would behead people. They would rape women. They would hang. They actually hung a 2-year-old child from a doorpost in Syria. They used to have something called these brigades that they had. I actually forget the name of them, but they were these death brigades that would go around and commit mass-scale executions. And this is so-called the moderate rebellion. If you remember, there was a gentleman by the name of Abu Sakar, and he was part of the Farouk Brigade. This Abu Sakar was one of the rebels who killed a Syrian soldier and cut out his heart and bit into it for the camera. The Farouk Brigade that he was a leader of was part of the Free Syrian Army. The FSA is an umbrella organization that kind of holds these death squads underneath it, sort of again as an umbrella organization. So the moderate cannibal, I guess we'll call him, was a part of the Free Syrian Army. So if anybody can look at these names, the first thing you gotta do is just forget that there's any differences, because they're not. There's only two groups fighting in Syria, and that is the secular government of Bashar al-Assad and death squad fighters funded by the West.
Yeah, ISIS is, I guess, what it is. The misconception or the perception of the general public in the West is that there are all these factions all fighting amongst each other, but ISIS has got the upper hand. And what struck me when this ISIS first kind of hit the headlines major was that they'd suddenly come into billions of dollars, and nobody could track where the money came from. Now, I've been into with a check in a bank with an insurance company's name written on it, and the teller asked me where it came from. Now, you know, I can't even cash a check for like €200 or whatever it was at the time, without being asked where it came from. Yet we've got a supposed terrorist organisation running about the deserts in the Middle East, laundering billions of dollars through presumably Western banks, and nobody can trace that money whatsoever.
Yeah, and you know what, they've tried to put this on two different things, and the first thing they've tried to say is that that ISIS is raising money through Twitter. And of course, if you know anything about social media, if you're an activist, then you probably understand that Twitter can decide at the drop of a hat, Twitter and Facebook, to suspend your account if it does something that, or if you post something that it wants to censor. So in other words, like, you know, social media will censor nudity, but not terrorism. And the idea is that they're raising so much money from Twitter donations, and this is unbelievable because we're being told that, you know, there are moderate rebels out there who are just poor and they don't have any money to procure weapons, and the United States is supporting them. But then there's the ISIS factions, the extremist rebels, the extremist death squad fighters that the United States doesn't want to support. But somehow they can raise more money on Twitter than the United States government can provide the moderate rebels. Yeah, I don't think that's the case. You've also got the question of the oil sales, right? ISIS is now an oil company, ISIS Incorporated, I guess. These guys have seized oil refineries and oil wells all across Syria, and they're somehow managing to hold the oil wells. They're managing to extract the oil, ship it, sell it, deliver it, and do it all under the nose of the most, you know, advanced surveillance state in the world, not to mention the other NATO countries that are part of it. And we just don't have any idea where this oil is going and where all this money's going to. I don't buy it because it's not realistic. The other story that's even more laughable is that ISIS is, you know, producing all of this oil and selling it to Assad. I don't know if you heard that one. The idea here is that ISIS is producing the oil, then selling the oil to Assad. So Assad will pay money to ISIS and then use the oil to fight ISIS. It doesn't make any realistic sense that this would happen. And, you know, some of these stories actually just become laughable. There was actually an attempt by Western media to portray Assad as the creator of ISIS at one point. And, you know, you just wonder how far this imbecilic propaganda can go before people will take a look at it and think, you know, this just doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, I guess it'll go on as long as enough imbecilic people believe it.
Which doesn't bode well for the future, because I see them believing it pretty easily.
Yeah, far too easily. And again, the thing about the oil is, I just couldn't understand that either. Like, who was buying it, and what currency were they paying in it? What were they using to buy this stuff? And as you say, it's going on to tankers. You would assume that it's being sold abroad. If they're raking in billions of dollars, or whatever, euros, pounds, whatever, they're having to pay bills.
Well, there was also the suggestion by NATO that we have to stop ISIS and their oil production, you know, to cut their funding, that we had to blow up the pipelines. Well, there's a problem with that, is because pipelines aren't just these aren't, you know, garden hoses. These things have long trajectories, and ISIS doesn't have control of the pipeline. ISIS does have control of a few, you know, oil rigs, but that's not the same as being in control of one's pipelines. So this was a justification for U.S. airstrikes in Syria, in some of these areas like Deir el-Zor. This is a place where, you know, Syria's Assad was about to regain territory. This has been a scene of fighting for some time, and over the last few months, the tide was really beginning to turn in the favor of Assad. And at this point, the Assad forces had actually cut off one of the bridges to where the death squad fighters were entering Deir ez-Zor, and they had surrounded the death squad fighters. So it was only a matter of time before the Assad forces had retaken Deir el-Zor. Well, what happens right on the precipice of that victory is that the United States comes in and blows up the oil refineries and some of the oil rigs that are out there. And essentially what it does is eliminates any of the gains that Assad would have made had he, he is on the way to retaking it regardless, but this removes the spoils of the battle, right? He would have retaken oil tanks and oil refineries and oil rigs, so he could use that for oil to sell, use that for his military. Well, that's gone now because the United States bombed it. And this is exactly what you're seeing when they bomb oil refineries. This is not oil refineries that this infrastructure does not belong to ISIS. It wasn't built by ISIS. It was built by Assad. It belongs to the Syrian government, but it's being destroyed by the United States for the purpose of weakening the Assad government under the guise of fighting ISIS.
Well, it's incredible that with all the military might that America, Britain, and whoever else wants to get involved in it, that Assad is managing to hold out against all this weaponry and subterfuge, if you like, and the use of these death squads, as you say, to terrorise his people. What do you think Assad will hold out in the long term, or is this just all a ploy to keep this kind of thing going for as long as possible?
Well, I don't really have high hopes for the situation. I have personally, I feel that it's really only a matter of time. I hope I'm wrong, but you just kind of see how these things have gone, and he's held out, unbelievably well, considering you look at what happened to Gaddafi. Assad has fared very well in this situation, largely because of the alliances with Russia. And Assad has played his cards pretty well on most instances, but some of them, I guess, one could question the justification for some of these decisions. But as for how long it will go on, I'm not really positive. There's also the option. We have Zbigniew Brzezinski's philosophy of creating micro-states and mini-states. And the idea behind this is creating a state that is so small and so impotent and so one-dimensional that it cannot stand up to the forces of corporations or banks or other larger governments and organizations like NATO. And you're seeing this being done now with the Kurdistan that's now being created. And there have been think tanks that have put out papers like the Brookings Institution that desire to have Assyria broken up into three parts: the sort of western part of Syria from Damascus on over to the the Lebanese border, Palestinian border, and to the coast being under the Assad or secular government that's allowed to stay there. And then you've also got the Kurdistan area that's being created now, and then this sort of chimera of death squad fanatics in the middle. And that's what the Brookings Institution had put out on their own white paper. So it's difficult to say how far it will go. I think personally that the goal is to completely overthrow Assad and not even really have to worry about the creation of these three different parts of Syria, but it's just to eliminate Assad in general and let the chips fall where they may, let the death squads take over, let chaos reign supreme like it does in Libya. And that is that's really anybody's guess as to how long it will last. What I will say is it looks like time is growing short, because you have Turkey openly calling for a buffer zone or a no-fly zone now, and you have the United States calling for the same thing.
Well, I mean, Turkey may regret wishing for that, because I'm sure they're on a list somewhere to be kind of taken out as well, somewhere down the line.
It's happening now, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to get it from all sides, really, Turkey. And, well, I lived in Turkey for a year, and I remember back then, back in 1999, and they had the young lads went off and did their national service over to the eastern Turkey, to the Kurdish area, and most of them came back completely screwed up, and it was basically their Vietnam there, and it was never reported at the time that there was this war going on, basically in the far east of Turkey, basically like a Vietnam, and nobody talked about it. But these guys were coming back completely screwed up, and they were in nightclubs and stuff, biting the tips of their tongues off and all sorts of horrendous stuff. So I don't know what kind of things they'd been witnessing over there, but if it's anything like the savagery we're seeing in Syria, well, who can blame them for acting like that? We'll go to a piece of music.
Do you get people of the world? Turn off your television.
Yes. Or shoot it.
People of the world, stop voting, for the system is rigged.
You mean broken? I mean, really.
When are we, as a people, going to stand up for our rights and take back the world?
You mean get rid of the evil scum? The evil scumbag people who made it this way? I mean, you're all fired.
I'm telling you, people, all people from around the world and the whole planet, it's time for you all to awaken and work against the construct. The construct. Wake up! Wake up!
Well, yeah, duh. Tune in to Awake Radio. Straight talk for the awake and the aware.
We're back live, as you just heard, and we have our guest, Brandon Turbeville, with us. We're going to continue on with the Syrian ISIS situation. And in your article, Brandon, you mentioned that there are no moderates in this situation, and I suppose that, I mean, for all it has faults, I suppose he's probably the most moderate guy there. But in terms of the so-called groups, or the one group that's supposedly there to save the world from Assad, you mentioned there are no moderates, and you've mentioned one of the atrocities of the guy cutting out the guy's heart and biting into it for the cameras. I mean, I don't know what kind of cameraman would sit there and watch that and actually film it, but there's something wrong with that guy as well, I would suggest, and he's certainly no moderate himself. So in terms of the depths that these guys will go to in terms of their brutality, I mean, do you want to give some examples of that?
Yeah, I don't know if it can get any worse. I mean, as I said, I did an article early on about many of these rebels who actually took a young child who was about 2-3 years old and killed his family in front of him, and then took the child out and killed the child and hung it from a doorpost. And there's actually, if you just Google some of the appropriate search terms by name, you'll see the article. We've got the picture up in the article if anybody wants to to take a look at that. And then, of course, we have the cannibal that you just mentioned. His name was Abu Sakar, a friend of John McCain's, by the way, and I've got the photographs up on my website for that. He's actually photographed with John McCain. And, the FSA, the burial brigades that they had, of course, this was mass executions. We've had all type of rapes and atrocities, beheadings. Some of the most brutal stuff. They forced a child to behead a number of Syrian soldiers, which you could find it on YouTube or maybe Live Leak or something. If really all you have to do is just Google the most disgusting thing you can think of in terms of an atrocity and put Syria next to it, and you'll find the handiwork of the Western Baghdad squads that are operating there. I realized in the first segment I kind of went on a tangent, and I didn't really flesh it out maybe as much as I should have in terms of the fact that there aren't any moderates in Syria. Right. The idea is not necessarily that some people are committing atrocities and some are not. The idea is that in reality, all of these groups are exactly the same. It's not that ISIS is more extreme than the Free Syrian Army, or the Al Qaeda groups are more extreme than Syrian Revolutionary Front. All of these names are entirely just tangential. They don't really matter. They're just different little brigades that were formed and divided and used, just as you can name anything, give anything a number of names, right? All of these guys were created by NATO and directed by NATO. It all comes from Al-Qaeda to begin with, and I'll mention that as well. But we even had an article, despite the mainstream media's attempt to portray these death squads as moderate versus extreme. There was an article in April of 2013 that came out in the New York Times that was written by Ben Hubbard, and Ben Hubbard was trying to give an idea of what the rebel-held areas looked like, and he pointed out that these were places that were under strict Sharia law, where there were all kinds of atrocities taking place, and his direct quote was, "Nowhere in rebel-controlled Syria is there a secular fighting force to speak of." That's a direct quote from the New York Times. So that's true, right? If there's a rebel-controlled area in Syria, then it is under fundamentalist death squad control. In fact, calling them rebels is a misnomer, because they're not rebels. In order to be a rebel against a system, you have to generally live under that system. Most of these people aren't Syrian. They're Saudi Arabians, they're Libyans, and they're Tunisians. In fact, Tunisians make up the bulk of the so-called opposition. We have the Free Syrian Army, as I mentioned earlier, that is supposedly the moderate opposition, but we've got Basil Idris, who was one of the FSA commanders, actually stating that his fighters work with al-Nusra and ISIS. And we had Jamal Marouf, who is the leader of the Syrian Revolutionary Front, saying the same thing. We had Abu Fida, who was part of the Revolutionary Council, saying that his fighters have joined ISIS and Nusra, and they work together with those organizations. So the makeup of these death squad organizations are, of course, fundamentalists, but they are also generally very mentally deficient, right? These are not smart people, generally speaking. I mean, there was a journalist who was kidnapped early on by these death squad fighters, and what she found is that most of them were morons. And I'm not saying that to be rhetorical. I'm just saying that they're incredibly stupid people, and they couldn't read, they couldn't write, they couldn't understand some basic concepts. And she even asked them, you say you hate the United States and Israel, but why are you taking money from them? And their response was, what are you talking about? We don't take money from Israel or the United States. And they had no idea. So at the bottom, these people are very, very low skilled, to say the least. And at the top, of course, you've got the sort of double agent, al-Baghdadi type figures who are actually CIA assets. I guess Anwar al-Awlaki would be another example of that type of thing. So these forces, of course, have been controlled by the United States for some time. We can go back to the late 1970s, where Zbigniew Brzezinski can be seen actually on video telling the Mujahideen in Afghanistan that this war is a holy war. This is your war. And when we armed them at the time, and ever since then we have continued to use them. We tried to use them to assassinate Gaddafi in the late 90s, and of course we used them on 9/11. And anybody that questions or calls it a conspiracy theory to suggest that Al-Qaeda was actually a tool of the United States government should go back and do some very basic, even mainstream cursory research that will show you otherwise. That will show you, will prove the fact that the United States indeed did control Al-Qaeda and still does. I mean, that we're deploying them now. We deployed them against Gaddafi in Libya a few years ago in 2010, and even earlier.
Well, of course, but that piece of footage you talk about with Brzezinski actually features Osama bin Laden, I believe, as well. And Brzezinski's standing there with the AK-47 and telling them that it's their holy war and all this kind of rhetoric. And of course, use them against the Soviets, or to draw the Soviets into Afghanistan in the first place. And the as you say, basic research that is on video. That's well known to have happened, and I think Brzezinski's even admitted that he created Al Qaeda to fight the Soviets, and of course they used them again in Kosovo, I believe. They took a load of them over there to create the only Muslim state in Europe, which is Kosovo.
Right. In fact, Brzezinski did a series of interviews where he admitted that they created Al Qaeda not to fight the Russians, but to draw them in, as you say. So this is all on record, and of course, the United States is also funding a lot of these Chechen rebels as well. But in terms of Syria, we had a report by Seymour Hersh that I think some people may be familiar with, entitled "The Redirection." And it was published in the New Yorker in 2007, where Seymour Hersh interviewed a number of high-level people in the Middle East, and he reported that the United States was indeed funding death squad terrorists to overthrow the governments in Syria and a few other Middle Eastern countries. That they were targeting Lebanon as well. We can see that happening in the Middle East right now as well. And also attempting to overthrow Iran. It actually goes back somewhat further, because there's an article in 2005 by Michael Hersh and John Barry for Newsweek called "The Salvador Option," and this is essentially the same discussion, but where these writers mentioned that the United States was funding death squad organizations to fight in Iraq and in Syria back in 2005. So you can imagine that if the mainstream reports are catching up to this in 2005, how long it had been deployed before, before we actually knew about it. So the question of the groups and how similar they are, I went through this at the beginning of the show, but this Baghdadi, we can kind of use him as a key, because his sort of run up through the ranks of the terrorist organizations is kind of indicative of how the organizations themselves developed. Right? He was Baghdadi is an Iraqi who had joined Al Qaeda, the big Al Qaeda organization, to fight against Saddam Hussein, as I mentioned earlier. And during the U.S. invasion, he sort of committed a number of atrocities against Shiites and Christians. He brought in Sharia law, and he beheaded a lot of people, slaughtered a lot of people in the public squares, and was actually arrested by the United States and brought to Camp Bucca for about 4 years. And if anybody understands how these prison camps work, they'll understand the fact that there's only two ways to come out of a U.S. torture camp, and that is either in a body bag or as a double agent. You don't get out any other way. And there's a lot of ways that they could turn these guys into double agents, whether it's just giving them the offer of their freedom for cooperation or actual MK Ultra style torture techniques to break a person's mental faculties down to work for them as an agent. But regardless, Baghdadi went in 2005, came out in 2009, so that's 4 years there in the torture camp. So I guess that's sort of the school of terrorists. So I guess he got his 4-year degree from Camp Bucca. But when he came back to Iraq, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq cell that he was a part of merged into the Islamic Emirate of Iraq, right? And in 2010, he was named the leader of the Islamic Emirate of Iraq. The IEI then started staging operations against Maliki, who was the prime minister of Iraq, and who was the governing officer who was responsible for warming relations between Iraq and Iran. And this was something, by the way, that the United States did not want to see. But the IEI had its sister organization, again, as I mentioned, in Syria, which was called at the time Al-Nusra Front. So basically, Baghdadi decides to unify even the two names and call it the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and the Levant, the IEIL. And that name then changed later to ISIL, which is Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. And then, of course, we changed it again to ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. This is, now it's IS, Islamic State, right? All it is a name change. People really need to grasp this concept and stop buying into the, day-to-day drama. Oh, al-Nusra is fighting with al-Qaeda, which is fighting with ISIS. That's a load of crap. They're not. Of course, there's fundamentalists at the bottom, and the nature of the fundamentalist is to, disagree with one small aspect of a religious tenet and then to try to kill its opponent. So there is, of course, some fighting that's going on. A number of them are killing each other. That's, again, the nature of fundamentalism. But as a whole, these groups are not fighting with one another. They are working together, and you can see that with the fact that the United States is arming these so-called moderate rebels who turn out to be, as I mentioned with the Free Syrian Army, just as bad as ISIS. There's no difference between the two, but because of a cleverly worked public relations campaign, there is this idea that some are moderate rebels. Well, they're given weapons. The United States gives them TOW missiles. They give them small arms. They give them a number of different types of aid. And what happens? ISIS marches to fight the Harakat Hazam brigade, and Harakat Hazam just walks away, and they leave their weapons conveniently, and ISIS comes in and takes them. So in other words, all of this is just a propaganda narrative to get us to believe that there are civil wars between the death squads and moderates and extremists, but there's not. It's only a few name changes that allow the U.S. government and NATO to say that we give weapons to moderate rebels but not to extremists, but in the end we're giving them to the extremists. And that's what people need to understand, that the United States is not trying to defeat ISIS. It doesn't want to defeat ISIS. Why would it? It controls ISIS. And again, that's the important part of what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah, well, of course, even the British Army, the American Army, in Afghanistan and Iraq, they left a lot of equipment out there worth like millions and millions of dollars and pounds for anybody to get a hold of. Now, if you wanted to start a conflict, the first thing you do is arm people, and I guess the easiest way to do it is just to go over there, invade the place, cause mayhem, and leave all the heavy armour and everything there for them to use when you've gone. And that's exactly what they did. And who knows who got what kind of military equipment. But going back to the atrocities, for want of a better word, before myself and Paula came back from the UK to the States, I visited a couple of my friends in a place called Basingbourne in Cambridgeshire. And we're changing countries, but it's the same scenario. And they were training Libyan troops there. And we were told this by the guy behind the bar, that these troops were being trained at the army base up the road. And then, of course, it turned out that some of these guys, they called them cadets, which was strange in the first place, because a couple of these guys were in their 30s and late 20s. So they certainly weren't cadets. They were grown men. But they decided to close that training program just recently and send all these guys home, 2,000 of them, because they've been out in the streets raping people and assaulting people and stuff like that. So it makes you wonder what they were training them to do. And as you mentioned, they're not the most intelligent of people. And if they've got those kind of people in there, and as you say, maybe it's MK Ultra techniques or whatever, are they actually training them to go back and commit atrocities?
Yeah, I don't doubt that they're doing that at all, and of course it strikes fear into the the hearts of your enemies to do this, to commit an atrocity and videotape it. But yeah, I mean the British government is involved in this ever so much as the United States government is. In fact, you can't really separate the two on a lot of issues. But yeah, there's a lot more I could say about that too, I guess. But the bombing of ISIS, I wanted to mention this too, because a lot of people are going to respond, well, if the United States doesn't want to destroy ISIS and defeat ISIS, why is the United States bombing ISIS? And my response to that would be, they're not. I've done a series of articles about this, and despite the mainstream media reports of the United States airstrikes, look at what they've actually bombed. You can see that all they've done is bomb Syrian infrastructure. They've bombed the oil refineries, the oil rigs. They've bombed grain silos. That was another that they came in and they targeted grain silos, and they're going to complain that there's a humanitarian issue, and they'll blame Assad for that. But they bombed the grain silos. That doesn't belong to ISIS. ISIS didn't build them either. And you look at what they've struck in Iraq. They were striking ISIS. This is probably one of the few instances where the United States actually did bomb ISIS, and that was in Erbil. That's because that's where a lot of Western major or international oil companies have their headquarters in the Kurdish areas there, and they have it's an extremely oil-rich area. So you don't want ISIS to veer off the path or get off the reservation and overtake those oil rigs. That's for the big boys. In fact, that was actually that bombing. If it's amazing what you can figure out just by using a map. And we had this situation where the Iraqi Yazidis were trapped on Mount Sinjar from the death squads there at the bottom of the mountain, and it was blasted across mainstream media that these people were about to they were either going to starve to death on the mountain, or they were going to be chopped to pieces by ISIS at the bottom. And the United States had to come in and engage in airstrikes to save them. So that's what they did. The United States engaged in airstrikes in Erbil, not in Mount Sinjar, right? The Yazidis were saved by Syrian Kurds and Iraqi Kurds, not by the U.S. Marines. But for all intents and purposes, the average American read those reports and said, "Oh, good, the United States is doing something about this." Well, the truth is, Erbil's on the other side of the country, and Erbil is where the oil infrastructure is for the international oil companies. So that's just another example of the propaganda narrative. The United States is not bombing ISIS. Again, look at Kobani, the small town that has been in the news for so many weeks in Syria, right on the Turkish border. The Arabic name is Ain al-Arab, which means Arab Spring, interestingly enough, and Kobani is the Kurdish name, which is being used in all of the media reports. But the Kurds are trying to fight off this major force of ISIS fighters. And the United States has been relentlessly bombing Kobani for the last few weeks. But with all the force that the United States has been pouring into Kobani, nothing seems to happen. The ISIS fighters continue to mount an offensive, to continue to make gains in Kobani. It's very interesting to me that if by now this place should have been obliterated, but ISIS forces have remained intact. So this tells me, and with a lot of the other information that I've talked about, that the United States is not targeting ISIS fighters at all, and that is just nothing more than propaganda. It's an excuse to justify military action in Syria. This is funny too. When we were talking about the airports earlier on, you were talking about playing the odds. I don't know if the ISIS fighters are just the most unlucky terrorists in the world, the Wile E. Coyote version of international terrorism, because everything they've done in the last few months has done nothing but encourage the American people to support U.S. military invasion. Right? But when the United States was talking about airstrikes, we had an American journalist, James Foley, beheaded. The British people weren't too keen on joining into the bombing, and then conveniently there was a British journalist beheaded. And so the French still dilly-dallied around in terms of whether or not they were going to engage in bombing inside Syria, and then a Frenchman was beheaded, and then the French jumped on board. So the United States is talking about flying over across Syria and engaging in airstrikes, but they're worried about the Syrian air defenses across the country and what happens. But ISIS overtakes the Takba Air Force Base in the eastern part of Syria and eliminates all the air defenses in the eastern part of Syria. So, well, what do you know? All that problem's been eliminated. And lastly, the United States, wants to impose a no-fly zone, and so even people in Congress started to speak up and say, well, wait a minute, why are we imposing a no-fly zone? ISIS doesn't have an air force. And what happens? ISIS gets an air force. ISIS captures planes in eastern Syria, and there's alleged video showing these planes being flown. So now that's the justification for a no-fly zone. I think, hopefully people are seeing how this works, right? Every time there's a need for a propaganda effort, ISIS terrorists are right there to provide what was needed to justify what the NATO countries want to do.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the unluckiest terrorist in the world, but certainly the most stupid. If you want to bring the might of the American military down on your head, you don't incite it, do you? You don't go out and do things that are going to encourage it, and you certainly don't. You want to demoralise the American people so they don't want a war. You certainly don't do things and videotape them and send them out over the internet so that the American people get behind the government to facilitate troops on the ground or more airstrikes or whatever it is. So as you say, unlucky or downright stupid. It's one or the other, isn't it? And getting down to the bottom of your article, and the same thing's going on in the UK. Talk of troops getting sent back to Iraq now. And what are these troops going to be used for? I mean, we can't get them from the air. I mean, do they think that sending a few guys with a few handguns is going to solve the problem?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, we just recently had this new beheading, this Peter Kassig, who was beheaded in Syria, and this, who knows what this is leading up to now? But I would just point out that the video itself is about 15 minutes long, and the overwhelming majority of the video is just some propaganda effects of soldiers marching. It's all just elaborate stuff, and then you get to the part where there's actual atrocities being committed, and there were 18 Syrian soldiers who were beheaded. Those guys weren't mentioned in mainstream reports except as a background narrative. There were 18 Syrian soldiers, and then poor Peter Kassig. I guess he counts more than they do, but the part of Kassig's beheading is not shown. All that is shown is the jihadist who is narrating the video standing next to a severed human head, and he claims that it's the head of Peter Kassig. So I've looked at these videos, James Foley beheading for one, and it's fake. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that James Foley is alive. I don't know that. But what I will say is the clip that I saw on the James Foley beheading was fake. I've seen beheadings. This was not one, right? We can go into reason why if you want. We could do that, but it's just they weren't real. And now for this video to come out and just have a human head on the ground and take the jihadist word for it. Considering the fact of what these Western-backed terrorists have done since their intervention in Syria, I would imagine a human head is pretty easy to find. I mean, they just chopped off 18 of them. I mean, how do we know it wasn't one of theirs? So I don't believe this propaganda video either. And I would also point out that Peter Kassig is the founder of a so-called aid organization, Special Emergency Response Team or something, or Special Emergency Response Initiative. I could get you the actual name of that organization, but this organization takes money from Conscience International, which is another non-governmental organization, which itself takes money from the National Endowment for Democracy. Now that might sound a little bit like drawing too many connections, but actually it's not when you understand how these NGOs work, right? You have a larger NGO that funnels money to a smaller NGO that funnels money to the actual NGOs that are there on the ground in these countries. And the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, has been one of the main sources of staging and funding color revolutions in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. It's well known for this. It has two tentacles, one being the International Republican Institute, which is sort of the Republican conservative wing of the NED, and then the National Democratic Institute, which applies to the Democrats and liberal side of things. John McCain is the chairman of the IRI, and of course John McCain is good friends with these terrorists. But I only say that to point out that Kasich has connections to the NED through the Conscience International organization. And I found some interviews in this article. The article is "The Beheading That Never Was: The Kasich Killing and Western War Propaganda," if people want to check that out. But the interview that Kasich did before, a couple of years ago, before obviously this situation today, and he expressed some sympathies with the death squad fighters. That the idea was that his choices were between giving out medicine to people or picking up a gun and fighting with the rebels. And of course that's not, if you're concerned about bringing peace and stability to the Syrian people, those are not your only option. So this guy obviously had sympathies with the death squads. He had connections to organizations that were funding the death squads. So whether he's alive or not, I can't say, but in terms of this propaganda video, I can say that I believe that is fake.
Well, the thing that struck me about these videos was that you always had some guy standing there with a knife in his hand, which is, I don't know, 6 to 8 inches long, and my first thought was, you can't cut a head off with that. A neck's a pretty tough thing, and there's a spinal cord to go through a spine. You just can't cut it off with something that looks like a bread knife. But anyway.
Well, I would just say that maybe they could get the head off. I mean, I think that, they tend to take their time with these things if need be. But if you watch the video with Foley, you'll see the knife go across the throat about 6 to 9 times. Right? I don't care how dull that knife is. There's going to be blood at some point. There was no blood. You can slow it down and count the amount of times that knife goes back and forth, and there's no blood, period. So that's fake. I mean, now whether he's beheaded after the fact, I don't know, but what we saw in the video sure wasn't a beheading. Yeah,
and as I say, why would you video something like that if unless you want to be attacked, unless you want to incite further intervention by so-called Western forces. Okay, we'll go another piece of music and then we'll come back.
You're listening to Awake Radio, straight talk for the awake and aware.
Reality Bytes Radio, second hour of tonight's broadcast, for the guest Brandon Turbeville. Now, we've done Syria, ISIS, and all the atrocities going on over there, but there's another atrocity happening in New York, it seems, and that's gun confiscation. Now, people in the UK won't have any idea about gun confiscation because it's so long ago that we had ours taken off of us. The only people in the UK now allowed guns, it seems, are criminals, police officers and farmers. And they're going after the farmers' guns as well now. Brandon, gun confiscation begins in New York via dead family members. And this is a tactic they use over here as well, which I'll come on to in terms of knives in a minute. But we'll start with gun confiscation in New York.
Yeah, well, what's happening there is they have something in New York State called the SAFE Act, and essentially this is totalitarian gun grabbing. If you've ever wanted to witness it, this is where you can look. New York City is probably the worst, and then there's New York State, which is unfortunately beholden to a lot of the policies coming out of New York City. But most of the people in Western New York are very favorable to gun rights, but that's beside the point. The idea here in New York State, because of the SAFE Act, is that you've got to have a permit to own a pistol, right? And if an individual has a permit and has the permission of their government to have a pistol, and the person dies, then there is a period of time where that weapon has to either be turned in to the proper authorities, or it has to be sold back to a dealer, or it has to be transferred. The permit has to be transferred. And some of these authorities are giving family members about 2 weeks to do all of that, right? So the idea is if your father dies or your mother dies, in the midst of planning the funeral and getting everything, the estate in order, the thing that you have to do immediately is get that gun re-registered somehow and transferred back to you or to the gun dealers. And it's something that has not largely been enforced, but recently it was announced by the Buffalo City Police that they're actually going to start going out and checking up and confiscating those weapons. So if they'll go look through the permit registry, because we're told in the U.S. in the gun grabbing debate, the gun control debate, we're told registration does not lead to confiscation. Well, it does here, and it does everywhere else, because what they're doing is they're looking at the registries, and then they're going out and checking the people who have these permits. And if the person is dead, they're tracking the gun down. They're going to confiscate it. So we had a report that they're saying that they're afraid that families are holding on to weapons even after the person who bought them originally is dead. So they're going out and looking for them. So if anybody doubts whether or not this is confiscation, there is the quote from, I'll just read this couple sentences, from Daniel Dorinda, who is the police commissioner in Buffalo. He says, this is a direct quote, he says, "We recently started a program where we're cross-referencing all the pistol permit holders with the death records, and we're sending people out to collect the guns whenever possible so that they don't end up in the wrong hands. Because at times they lay out there and the family is not aware of them, and they end up just out on the street." And that's the end of the quote. Now, I don't know how they end up out on the street. The family's not aware of them, but there you go. So that's what they're doing in New York. They're allowing 15 days after the death of a family member, and then they're going to show up at your door and demand the gun. And I don't have any doubt that the police stormtroopers of the Buffalo City Police will come in and do whatever they have to do to get those guns away from the citizens who rightly have a right to own them. So I've got no doubt that the people are going to give them up either, and I've got no doubt that nobody's going to come to make a big stand. I said in the article that we're referencing here is that I don't have any expectation of all of these people who constantly talk so loud and say things like they wouldn't take my guns or they wouldn't do that here. Well, yeah, I have no expectations that these people will do anything but talk. We had that a situation in Bunkerville, Nevada, where Cliven Bundy, or I'm going to call him Cloven Bundy. I think that was not a good idea to rally around. But people showed up from all across the country to rally around this guy's rights, which he didn't even have. But now people are going to have their guns confiscated in New York, and I bet we won't see any action to stand up for gun rights there. So that's just my little 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I read through this article, and that sentence struck me as well, the one you mentioned there, because at times they lay out there and the family is not aware of them, and they end up just out in the street. And I thought, well, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. How did they end up in the street? Are they just throwing them out in the trash? I mean, how do they? Does somebody just throw it out the window? I mean, it's just crazy.
We'll see. We'll see, Neil. Guns are very temperamental creatures, and when they're not given attention, they get up and they just walk right out the door.
Yeah, into the wrong hands, apparently. Yeah. The fact that they're using bereavement to basically knock on somebody's door, and even if the funeral and all the arrangements are dealt with, the last thing somebody wants is a couple of heavily armed police officers knocking on the door saying, "Give me your guns." They're just going to hand them over to get rid of them, to get rid of the police officers. I mean, that unless they're kind of so distraught that they might react differently. In which case they may find themselves shot because they refuse to hand them over and possibly get a bit upset, as they've every right to do.
Yeah, and we've seen this in the U.S. before, right? The disarming of populations. In the article that I've done, there's a video of of confiscation in New Orleans. And it's for anybody who, I live in the South, and you hear stories about something in New York or Maryland or Boston and, California, and everybody kind of laughs, and they say, because, these places are, cesspits, and people will, no offense to the people who live there, but it's a cesspit, and people down here will say, well, they might do that in California, they might do that in Connecticut, but they won't do that in South Carolina, and they won't do that in Alabama. Well, Louisiana's pretty far south, and it's pretty big on its gun rights, and they did that in Louisiana. They came through, and they went door to door, and they took guns, and you know what people did? They gave them up. And I think that, unfortunately, is what people will do today, because people have, especially on the internet, they have this ability to talk tough and say, I wouldn't do this, I wouldn't do that, I would stand up and fight. But they don't. And they don't, because they don't have to. And they don't go defend their neighbors or their friends or their fellow activists. And then when it comes around to them, because the fact is, it will come around to them, right? They will do this in New York and in Connecticut and California first. And then they'll move on to other states. Then they'll move on to the states, they'll go from Maryland and New York to Indiana or, Ohio, and then they'll move to South Carolina and Texas. And as long as they do it incrementally, people never actually put up a fight. That's unfortunate.
Yeah, well, I think those videos from New Orleans, with the troops on the streets, these guys were pointing automatic weapons into people's living rooms. I don't think anybody's going to say, hold on a minute, you're not getting me gun, because these guys will just shoot you. They're not going to take any prisoners, and they're not going to risk being shot themselves.
Yeah, and in fact, toward the end of that video in the article, you can see there's this National Guard soldier who was asked by a reporter, would he shoot American citizens, or essentially asked, would he shoot American citizens, and he said yes. And just take a look at what we've allowed to appear here. This happened years ago, and you can see the police, and you can't really tell the difference between the police and the military.
Yeah, well, that young, I think it was a National Guardsman, was he? I think he was asked a question. How do you feel about this? And he says, well, it's. I'm paraphrasing, but he termed it as if he was just thinking about what he might have to do in the future. And that's when he asked the question about shooting Americans, and he said yes. They're obviously training these guys to do that, because I'd imagine 30, 40 years ago that would have been unthinkable for an American soldier to be walking down the street thinking about shooting an American citizen.
Yeah, and I did an article a while back. I actually broke the story. It was about the FBI counterterrorism units who were visiting South Carolina gun shops, and I had a source who, we'll say, witnessed the exchange, where the FBI counterterrorism officer came into a gun store and passed out a flyer that, with his contact information in it, and wanted the individuals in the gun store to report any suspicious activity. And the suspicious activity was not Islamic fundamentalism; it was sovereign citizens, anti-government rhetoric, or even just people who complain about big governments. That could be like Republicans, right? So this is the information they were looking for at a gun shop here in South Carolina. Because it wouldn't happen here in South Carolina, but it's happening all across the country.
Well, there was the definition of terrorism in Britain was anybody who spoke out against government, and that immediately put all the opposition parties labelled as terrorists, but nobody seemed to get that.
Yeah, and David Cameron now has the new definition of non-violent terrorism, right?
Okay, this for people in America. I'm from Scotland. I lived in the UK most of my life, with brief spells over in Turkey, Bulgaria, England, Wales, Ireland, and it doesn't stop at guns. And just last week, last week in the UK, Lancashire Constabulary, that's a police force in Lancashire, north of England, has joined forces with the groundbreaking national anti-knife crime campaign, Save a Life, Surrender Your Knife, as the force's knife amnesty comes to an end. So it's just finished, but this is a trial balloon kind of thing, but it's a national thing. So they've trialled it, and now, as you say, it's going to move on to another area of the UK where they'll do it, and they'll keep raking in these knives. And as is well known in the UK, and I'm sure the same in America and every other country, most stabbings happen in people's houses with domestic kitchen appliances. So I don't know what good this is ever going to do. If somebody wants to stab somebody, they'll just take a knife out of the kitchen drawer and they'll go off with it and do something with it. They don't have to buy a Bowie knife from the local hardware shop or anything. But it doesn't even stop there. I don't know if do they have anti-knife campaigns in the US?
I haven't heard of any anti-knife campaigns in the U.S., although we do have knife laws. We do have laws against automatic knives, right? If you have switchblades, are illegal in most places.
Yeah, we have that rule as well. I think nobody's allowed to carry a blade that's over 4 inches long.
Yeah.
And if you even if you have what they call them box cutters in America, they call them Stanley knives in the UK. You're not even allowed to carry one of them unless you can prove that it's actually for work. You know, it's just, and any, like a penknife, even a penknife, if the blade is longer than 4 inches, I think it is, you have to have some plausible reason for carrying it. You're not just allowed to whittle sticks or peel an apple or anything anymore. But it doesn't even stop there. Now they're going to go after our dogs. So the guns went a long time ago, and we spoke off air, going back hundreds of years. The Scots, the Irish were all disarmed. They weren't allowed to carry swords, knives, anything. Even now, traditionally when you get married in Scotland, you wear a kilt, and you used to be allowed to have what they call the skein dhu, which is like a black knife, and it went down your sock, and the blade was possibly, 5-6 inches sometimes. You're not even allowed them anymore at weddings, because apparently too many people were being stabbed at weddings. But maybe that's something to do with the amount of alcohol people are consuming, and not really the knives in the first place. It's the people again. It's not guns that kill people. It's people that kill people and control the guns and the knives. But they're going after our dogs now. And dogs in England. This is just England, so they're trialling it in England. You've got Scotland and Wales to go as well. Maybe this applies to Wales as well, because it generally does. If England gets it, Wales gets it as well. But every dog owner in England will have to microchip their animal from 2016 under plans intended to cut a rise in stray dogs. Any excuse will do, any excuse. But it's obviously they want to get your dog off you, because I would imagine that the majority of people in Britain who own dogs are not wealthy people. And if your dog isn't microchipped, you're going to face a fine of up to £500, which is quite a lot. What's that about? Nearly $800. So we're not even going to have a dog to protect us anymore. So I mean, they would obviously. You're still going to have kitchen knives, so I don't see how that's going to help anybody. But I mean, a dog in the UK where burglaries are rampant, because nobody's got the means to defend themselves apart from their kitchen knives, I guess. And I was asked when I was coming over to the States, I said, what are you going to do over there? There's all this violence and all the rest of it. I said, hey, they've got guns over there. I says, what have you got in the UK to protect yourself? Nothing. I said, they're going after your knives, your dogs, everything. Is it? And I said to you off there, is it going to come to the point where we go to the local kitchen shop and all you can buy is plastic cutlery?
Well, probably so eventually. I have no doubt that they'll go after the kitchen knives eventually, because, as you said, so many people get stabbed at home. So I guess they'll be using that, probably using that as an excuse to take children next.
Well, yeah, you've got dangerous weapons in the house. You have a bread knife there, which a child could possibly harm themselves with if you leave them alone to cut up a loaf of bread. But the issue of the dogs, I mean, Britain is possibly world known for being a nation of dog lovers, as it were, and in times of recession, depression, call it what you will, there are a lot of people getting pretty desperate, and they will break into your house for anything that they can sell, whether it's for drugs or simply to eat, and to take people's dogs off them is, I don't know. I'm not quite sure how the UK people all tolerate it. It seems quite bizarre. But you read down this article and they say it's costing the taxpayer £57 million a year because of stray dogs, apparently. But they say it's about 100,000 dogs are dumped or lost each year at a cost of £57 million. That works out at £570 a dog. I don't know what kind of programs they got in place, but that seems an awful lot of money to rehome a dog, because it says here that half of them are returned to the owner. How can that cost £570? But maybe they're just not making enough money out of it or something. And I suppose, as I say, poor people are not going to go and microchip their dog because there'll be a cost implied in that as well. I'm sure that'll be £100 or something, and they're going to be fined £500. So the dogs are going to go. So if anybody in America wants to know where gun confiscation leads, this is how ridiculous it gets.
We're also getting the propaganda campaigns, though, about microchipping animals. We've been getting that for a few years. Right now, it's still in the encouragement phase, because it's still sort of snob appeal, right? You have your animal chipped and you won't ever lose your animal. So right now we're still being encouraged to do it by propaganda. But again, eventually we'll get the mandates as well. A lot of the humane societies already chip them and won't let animals go without being chipped. So if you're looking for a rescue animal, that's already been done.
Well, that happens in the UK. If you buy an animal from an animal welfare centre, it is chipped already. And there's many articles out there showing that these microchips are causing cancer in the pets. And these are not just from alternative media sites. They're from dog owner sites. And there's one site, Dogs Naturally, a magazine for dogs without boundaries, as if the dog can read it. But maybe you can with a microchip. Maybe it's a microchip in the brain that makes them super intelligent. He can actually read English or a variety of languages. Who knows? But even veterinarian sites are saying that these chips cause cancer in the animals. So again, it's a no-win situation. If you're a dog owner, you're going to be fined £500 for not chipping, or your dog's going to be dead in a couple of years anyway. So that's it. But of course, you mentioned propaganda about it, and of course, this is it's only a short step towards human microchipping. I mean, are you going to be allowed to take your baby out of the hospital unless it's microchipped? And if you don't microchip your baby, are you going to be fined £1,000? Or, how ridiculous is it going to get?
Yeah, and as I said to you in the break, here in the United States, we used to joke about the English, gun laws, and we'd say, what's next? Are they going to start banning knives? And now they're trying. And I was joking with you in the break, and I said this has ruined comedy for me, because now I can't make jokes about the absurdity of these things, because it's true. It's the absurdity. The jokes are now reality. It's not jokes anymore, and people can look. And this is the same thing that I was talking about in terms of what some people do in certain parts of the country. Look at New York or California and kind of laugh and say, "Oh, well, look at those places. Well, of course it'll go there. Every bad oppressive law passes in New York and California," as if it won't come around to them. And it will come around to them. It always comes around to them. And by then you've laughed at other people and ignored the plight of other people to the point that nobody has any interest in standing up for you. So that's the direction that it always leads.
Yeah, it's the scenario of first they came for the Jews, and I said nothing, and that's where it's going. But we'll go to another piece of music, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about feeding the homeless, because that's another thing that's happening in the UK as well, where they're banning that. And I see you have an article up there about the very same thing, and it applies to veterans. So we'll go to a piece of music, and we'll come back and discuss that for the last 20 minutes or so.
O truther, wherefore art thou truther? Deny thy propaganda and refuse thy lie. Or if thou wilt not, be but sworn, my love, and I'll no longer be a slave.
Shall I hear more, or shall I speak at this?
'Tis but thy tyrannic minds that is thine enemy. Thou art thyself, though not an illusion. What is an illusion? It is nor hand, nor foot, no arm, nor face, nor any other part belonging to a man. Oh, be some other wisdom. What is in truth? That which we call a false flag, by any other word would be propaganda thy truth. So truther would, were he not truther called, retain that dear perfection which he owes without that title. Truth, speak thy mind, and ask for thy soul, which is true part of thee. Take all myself.
You're tuned into Awake Radio, romancing the truth to unite a world with inseparable love. awakeradio.us, awakeradio.co.uk.
Okay, welcome back to the last 15 minutes or so with Brandon Turbeville, our guest today. And we're going to discuss feeding the homeless, as it were. But in the case of this article he's got up on his site, BrandonTurbeville.com, it's War is a Racket. Thank a veteran, but don't feed one. And the picture you've got in the article is good. I like it. It's a picture of the back of an SUV with an American flag on it and a support our troops sticker. And the guy standing at the side of the road with his crutch on, with a placard saying homeless vet, and the driver saying get a life you worthless bum. And we were talking off air about whether the troops coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan and well shortly Syria and no doubt are getting treated any differently than the guys did when they came back from Vietnam. What would you say to that?
Well, I don't think they are getting treated any different, except that we now tell these guys, thank you for your service, and that makes us feel nice, warm, and cuddly inside, like we've done something, and we can move on and forget about them. And the difference in Vietnam is that people didn't really have that clever saying, or not one that I know of anyway. So to me, I don't see that we're treating them any differently. They still get substandard care. They still get a few extra little perks here and there, but largely ignored when it comes to their injuries and the mental illness that comes from combat and so forth. So and also the fact that veterans have a much higher suicide rate, and that veterans have a very high rate of homelessness, which is ignored largely, unless we have a foundation that's trying to collect money under their guise. But I don't think they're really being treated any differently, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, there's more soldiers actually in service still committing suicide more than soldiers who've been killed in combat. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop there, as you say. Once they're out of the service, there's a high rate of suicide as well. So that figure must be far higher in terms of suicide to death in combat. And you got to feel for these guys. I mean, as you say, that they've suffered not just the physical injuries. Some of them possibly don't have any physical injuries, but certainly they're going to have the mental trauma, what they've witnessed and what they've done themselves, and of course a lot of guilt associated with that as well, I'd imagine. Yeah,
and part of the article was really kind of that we were talking about was kind of in two parts, because the first part was this phrase, thank you for your service, really irks me. It really drives me up the wall, because I think it's incredibly stupid and it's incredibly empty as well. I personally will never say it because, first of all, what is the service being performed? Well, I'm not, as much as I feel for war veterans and military veterans, I will not thank somebody from going over to Iraq and killing somebody just like me. I will not thank you for that. That is not a service to me. That is a service to a bank, to a corporation, and to some world oligarchy. So no thanks for that. But it's also very empty because, again, as I said, people will say thank you for your service as if they've just checked off the box and signed all the documents that they need to sign, and they've done everything they need to do and paid their debts to each veteran. If I say thank you for your service, then my obligation is finished. Now you can go off to the street corner and starve to death. I thank you for your service, and that's all there is to it. And that's why I think it's so empty, because we can continue to push and allow for wars and send these a lot of them kids over to go get killed, and then when they come back, the answer is, well, sorry about your legs, but thank you for your service, or your health care needs aren't going to be met, but thank you for your service. It's just empty. It's weak. That's another reason I won't engage in that saying. But all across the country, and it's just funny. I wrote this article on Veterans Day to point out that with veterans that have such a high rate of homelessness, there are cities all across the country that are banning feeding homeless people. Now, again, that's another thing that years ago you could have joked about, right? What's next? Is the government going to ban feeding the homeless? Well, they've done that, right? Myrtle Beach, not far away from where I'm at, has actually charged a person for feeding homeless people. In fact, he was feeding them in the park, and they told him that he couldn't do that anymore. So he moved the homeless, the feeding session out to a church that volunteered. And then they came out and told the church they couldn't do it because of regulations, food safety regulations. So the guy started doing it at his house, on his private property, inviting people over as guests, and he was actually charged and fined for that. We've also got Orlando. We've got a number of other cities across the country. I can't mention them all, but there's a 90-year-old man who's been arrested 3 times just for feeding the homeless. I mean, you can get arrested for feeding homeless people, and that's one of the most basic expressions of humanity, right? To feed someone who's hungry, and now that is criminalized, and there's no outcry, or if there is an outcry, it's in maybe a few activist communities, but nobody is horrified at this. We're not standing up as a society and saying, you've gone too far. We're abiding by the laws, and that's a problem. That's a real problem in our culture.
Yeah, I mean, there's a saying that bad laws should be ignored, and this is obviously a bad law. And the case of the 90-year-old man, I read it on air a couple of weeks ago when it first came out, and he's actually a World War II veteran himself. And he was out in Fort Lauderdale, and as you say, he was arrested, and I think you're correct, it was his 3rd time I think he'd been arrested. But a 90-year-old man, twice, it says here twice, so I presume this was the 3rd time. He wasn't quite arrested, but armed police officers are going up to a 90-year-old World War II veteran, and there can't be many of those left. And he's simply feeding, as you say, poor homeless people, possibly homeless veterans from the Iraq War or Afghanistan War, and that's supposedly criminal. Well, that's inhumane to stop people doing that. And that's where the criminality is. And if police officers can't understand that, then there's something terribly wrong with the police officers, because the same thing has been done in the UK. And again, people say, it's a conspiracy theory, but it's not coincidental that this is happening right across the world in so-called Western civilized society, where you're not allowed to feed homeless people. It's no coincidence that it's happening at the same time.
Yeah, and what's again, I went on to the issue of homelessness because the article, it was Veterans Day, and the veteran community has so many rates of homelessness. And what's so ironic is that Orlando, Myrtle Beach, these other cities that are enforcing these laws, or preventing people from feeding homeless people, these same cities will organize Veterans Day parades and have these ridiculous floats and all these big flag waving ceremonies and thanking veterans for their service, and then go out and arrest someone who's trying to feed them. And that's not ironic. I guess what, to me, obviously it bothers me to see laws like this getting passed. What bothers me even more is that there's not a massive resistance to it, is that people will see it and say, oh, it's illegal to feed homeless people. I better not disobey the law. I better not feed the homeless people. I think that's what bothers me much more, is the fact that people just acclimate to it and acquiesce to it. And this should just be, a knee-jerk reaction should make you want to resist it and ignore the law and go out and violate it. So I openly encourage people to violate this law. I'll feed homeless people whenever I want.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with you, and I've said it on air many times. People complain about getting speeding tickets or things like that. And I said the simple solution is you take off your registration number, because that's the only way they get you. Everybody takes off the registration number. Their cameras are useless. you know, and they ain't going to make any money out of them, so that they ain't going to be able to pay people to service them or to administer the fines, because there will be no fines, and the computers will be useless as well, and all things like that. Just start saying no to it. I mean, if somebody bans feeding the homeless, then 1,000 people or 2,000 people need to get out and start feeding the homeless, and just totally ignore it, and see what and have 5,000 or 6,000 police officers turn up to try and stop you. It isn't going to happen.
Yeah, and if it does, then maybe you'll succeed in bringing out a few more people after they see how they brought out hundreds of riot cops to stop Good Samaritans. So
yeah, I've got another article here. The 20th of February 2014. That was just this year. And I was looking through something else there about when they started first touting this. It's illegal to feed the homeless was back in 2011 in the UK, and now we've got it's now illegal to be homeless in Britain and the US, according to this article. And they're talking about a place in South Carolina. That's where you're from, isn't it? Columbia, South Carolina. Homeless people are set to be shipped off to a camp on the outskirts of town because it's illegal to be homeless.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is that they'll put them in a camp, and they're not free to leave whenever they want. There are certain hours that they can come in and certain hours that they can go out. And that sounds an awful lot like incarceration to me. But this is something that was passed, and it was passed by this little it was pushed by this little weasel in the Columbia Council who ran on being a charity promoting individual, and this was, I don't remember his name, but I did a report on him on one of my shows. But yeah, he was a little weasel in the city council who pushed this law, and the fact, as you say, that it's popped up across the world, especially in the Western world over the last few years, is no coincidence. That it just happened to pop up here and there in the United States and the United Kingdom. It's never a coincidence when you start seeing these laws and these policies just crop up at the same time in all these diverse places. It's actually an agenda playing out.
Yeah, and the whole fact that it makes no sense either. I mean, surely any government would be happy if its in inverted commas citizens went out and helped people who were less fortunate themselves, so the government wouldn't have to bother. You think it'd be to their advantage? That's
what they say. Whenever you argue against cuts in Social Security or unemployment insurance or Medicare or something, the response is always, well, you should look to charitable organizations to pick up the slack. Well, they're banning the charitable organizations. You can't go out and feed homeless people. But the charitable organizations only exist as a fallback whenever they try to impose austerity. So you're getting hit on two sides.
Yeah, and of course a lot of those charities are controlled anyway, and fully in bed with the agenda as it is. And I'm sure in some of these cases, some of these camps will be run by so-called charities, private organisations that are going to get paid for everybody who gets put in them, no doubt, just like the private prisons.
Well, in Myrtle Beach here in South Carolina, they were one of the biggest proponents of the law that banned feeding the homeless was a charitable organization. Yeah.
It's like I was talking to one of the lads here. It's another ridiculous law. Anywhere in Europe, not the UK at the moment, but if you drive across Europe, you have to have your headlights on 24 hours a day, spring, summer, autumn, winter. It doesn't matter, 24 hours a day. And the only thing you can think to that is that the light bulb manufacturers have lobbied the government because they won't sell enough bulbs, because there's no logic to it. But the police will stop you and fine you if you don't have your lights on in broad daylight on a sunny day.
Well, we have a law here in South Carolina that's called the brown bag law. So if you go out and you buy a bottle of beer or a bottle of liquor, it has to be put in a brown paper bag. And if you don't put that in a brown paper bag, the store will be fined. And all this was a result of lobbying by the paper industry that wanted more use for their products.
Well, we're getting into the kind of ridiculous now, but there was a law in Ireland that it was illegal to come out of a pub drunk. And it was down to the guy behind the bar, or the manager of the bar, was going to be held responsible. But there was no evidence whatsoever to suggest that the person hadn't come in drunk in the first place, and you'd thrown him out.
Well, just to try to one-up you there, in Texas, the police raided a bar and arrested patrons for being drunk in the bar.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's actually illegal to be drunk in Britain. It's illegal to be drunk, and yet, the nightclubs are open until 4 in the morning. So I think we've kind of we've gone from the sublime to the ridiculous. But anyway, not to worry. Any final words you want to give out your websites and some of the other sites you write on?
Yeah, sure. You can find my work at activistpost.com and theantimedia.org. And also, if you're interested in my work specifically, then please go to brandonturbeville.com, and that's where I repost all of the articles and all of the interviews that I do. And also check out my show, Truth on the Tracks, over at ucy.tv.
What nights is that on?
That's on Monday nights and Friday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Okay. We'll possibly do this again in another month or so if you're up to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Up for it, surely. Sorry. Okay, we're down to the last minute, so with that, we'll say good night, and thanks very much for your time and your insight into all things Syrian and ISIS and gun confiscation and all that stuff, and a bit of fun at the end as well. It's always good to have something to laugh about, because at the end of the day, there's not an awful lot to laugh about these days. So thanks again for your time, Brandon, and hope to speak to you again soon.
All right, thanks for having me on.
Cheers.